Have you ever driven down a desolate, winding road, surrounded by an ocean of pitch black trees, and felt the sudden, icy prickle of being watched? You grip the steering wheel, wrapped in the fragile safety of your car's glowing dashboard, praying that the shadows outside remain empty. But what happens when the darkness decides to step into the light? Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Tonight, we journey into the suffocating isolation of the Australian bush. On the chilling winter night of August 8th, 1993, multiple strangers driving along the exact same treacherous mountain road encountered something that defies all earthly logic. A blinding amber light descending from the heavens, towering, featureless silhouettes with burning, hateful red eyes, and a terrifying block of missing time that would leave physical scars and shatter the reality of everyone involved. Before we dim the headlights and venture into the unknown, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Tell me, have you ever seen something unexplainable in the dead of night? Now, let's get into tonight's story. Australia's most terrifying UFO mystery. There is a specific kind of isolation that you can only truly understand if you have ever driven through the Australian bush in the dead of night. It is not just the absence of light. It is a heavy, almost suffocating darkness that seems to press against the windows of your vehicle. The trees, towering eucalyptus and ancient ferns, crowd the edges of the narrow roads like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the brief, fleeting sweep of your headlights. Out there, away from the comforting glow of the city, the silence is absolute, broken only by the hum of your own engine and the occasional, unsettling rustle of unseen wildlife in the dense underbrush. When you are driving through that kind of desolate landscape, your car becomes a tiny, fragile bubble of safety and normalcy. Inside, you have the faint glow of the dashboard, the hum of the heater, and the comforting presence of your family. You feel secure, insulated from the vast, empty wilderness just a few inches of glass and metal away. But what happens when that fragile bubble is suddenly and violently punctured? What happens when you are driving down an empty, pitch-black road, miles away from any help, and you suddenly realize that the darkness outside your window is not empty at all? What do you do when you are forced to confront the horrifying reality that you have driven your family right into the path of something ancient, malevolent, and entirely unearthly? This is the true, first-hand story of a young mother in Australia who is driving her family home from a completely ordinary dinner party, only to experience an event so profoundly terrifying and so well documented by independent witnesses that it remains one of the most compelling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern history. Our story takes place in the heavily forested, mountainous region known as the Dandenong Ranges, which is located just a short distance east of the sprawling city of Melbourne in the state of Victoria, Australia. The Dandenongs are renowned for their breathtaking beauty during the day. They are characterized by towering mountain ash trees, lush, damp fern gullies, and winding, scenic roads that cut through the steep hillsides. But at night, the character of the Dandenong Ranges changes completely. The dense canopy of leaves blocks out the moonlight, and a thick, eerie fog often rolls in from the surrounding valleys, clinging to the winding roads and reducing visibility to almost zero. It is a beautiful place, but it is also a place where it is very easy to feel completely alone. In the late summer and early autumn of the year, 1993, a woman named Kelly Cahill lived near this region with her husband, Andrew Cahill, and their 3 young children. Kelly and Andrew were in their late 20s, and they lived a remarkably normal, quiet life. Kelly was a devoted stay-at-home mother, dedicating all her time and energy to raising their kids, managing the household, and ensuring their home was a warm, welcoming place. She was grounded, practical, and deeply religious, possessing a strong moral compass and a no-nonsense approach to life. Andrew was equally grounded, a hardworking family man who provided for his wife and children. They were not the kind of people who sought out the supernatural, nor were they interested in science fiction or the paranormal. In fact, If you had asked Kelly about unidentified flying objects or extraterrestrials before this incident, she likely would have laughed and dismissed the entire concept as absolute nonsense. The events that would forever alter the trajectory of their lives began on the evening of August 8th, 1993. It was a Sunday, and the Cahill family had spent the evening at the home of some close friends who lived in the Dandenong foothills. It had been a wonderful, entirely unremarkable evening, filled with good food, warm conversation, and the chaotic, happy sounds of their children playing together. As the night wore on, the kids began to grow tired, rubbing their eyes and yawning, signaling to Kelly and Andrew that it was time to pack up and make the journey home. By the time they gathered their belongings, bundled the children into their coats, and said their final goodbyes, it was very late. The exact time they pulled out of their friend's driveway was just past midnight, officially crossing over into the early hours of August 9th, 1993. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp, biting chill of the Australian winter. Andrew settled into the driver's seat, turning on the heater to combat the frost forming on the edges of the windshield, while Kelly climbed into the passenger seat. Their 3 children were securely fastened into the back seat, and within minutes of the car pulling away, the gentle, rhythmic motion of the vehicle lulled all 3 of them into a deep, peaceful sleep. The route they had to take to get home involved driving along the Belgrave-Hallam Road. This is a notorious stretch of highway that winds its way through the steep, heavily forested foothills of the Dandenong Ranges. It is a treacherous road, even in the best of conditions, characterized by sharp, blind curves, steep inclines, and deep, plunging gullies on either side. On this particular night, the road was completely deserted. There were no streetlights, no houses visible through the dense trees, and absolutely no other cars on the road. The only illumination came from the headlights of Andrew's car, which cut a narrow, pale cone of light through the absolute blackness of the night. For the first 20 minutes of the drive, the only sounds inside the car were the low hum of the engine, the steady whoosh of the tires on the cold asphalt, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping children in the back. Kelly was slouched comfortably in the passenger seat, staring out the window into the dark trees, letting her mind wander. Andrew was focused intently on the winding road ahead, both hands firmly on the steering wheel, carefully navigating the sharp bends. They were approaching a particularly dark, isolated section of the Belgrave-Hallam Road when Kelly noticed something out of place. Through the dense canopy of trees to her left, she caught a glimpse of a light in the distance. At first, she thought it was just the headlights of another car coming down a parallel dirt track, or perhaps an unusually bright security light on a farmhouse hidden deep in the valley. But as they continued to drive, the angle changed, the trees thinned out slightly, and Kelly was able to get a better look at it. The light was not white or yellow like a standard headlight. It was a brilliant, intense, pulsating amber-orange color, and it wasn't attached to a house or a car. It was floating in the air, several hundred feet above the dark, rolling hills. Kelly sat up a little straighter in her seat, frowning as she pressed her face closer to the cold glass of the passenger window. She watched the orange light for a few moments, trying to make sense of its movements. It wasn't moving in a straight, steady line like a commercial airplane, and it wasn't blinking with the standard red and green navigation lights that all aircraft are required by law to carry. "Andrew," Kelly said, her voice quiet, not wanting to wake the children. "Look over there. What is that?" Andrew briefly took his eyes off the road and glanced in the direction Kelly was pointing. He saw the strange, glowing orange orb hovering in the distance. He narrowed his eyes, processing the sight for a second, before turning his attention back to the treacherous, winding road ahead. "It's probably just a helicopter, Cal," Andrew replied dismissively, his tone completely unconcerned. "Maybe the police or an emergency medical flight." Kelly continued to stare at the object, feeling a sudden, inexplicable knot of unease forming in the pit of her stomach. "I don't know, Andrew," she murmured. "It doesn't look like a helicopter. It's too bright, and there's no noise. If it were a helicopter that close, we'd hear the rotors, wouldn't we?" Andrew just shrugged, keeping his focus on the asphalt. He was a pragmatic man, and a strange light in the sky was not something he was going to waste time worrying about, especially while driving on a dangerous road with his family in the car. But Kelly could not tear her eyes away from it. As she watched, the object began to move, and the way it moved defied all logic and conventional physics. It didn't bank or turn. It simply darted to the left with incredible sudden speed, stopped dead in midair, and then shot upward before slowly descending again. The entire time, it maintained that brilliant, pulsating orange glow. Suddenly, the object seemed to change direction entirely. It stopped its erratic bouncing and began to move in a straight, terrifyingly fast line directly toward their car. Kelly felt a surge of genuine panic rising in her chest. "Andrew," she said, her voice rising in pitch, practically shouting now. "It's coming toward us! It's coming right at us!" Andrew finally realized the urgency in his wife's voice. He hit the brakes, slowing the car down to a crawl as he leaned forward, peering out through the top of the windshield. The orange light was no longer a distant orb. It was growing larger and more brilliant by the second, hurtling through the night sky with staggering velocity. It was moving so fast that within seconds it was directly over the road ahead of them. Then, the object suddenly dropped out of the sky, plunging down into a deep, dark gully located in a large open paddock just to the left of the highway. Andrew brought the car to a complete stop on the shoulder of the road. He left the engine idling, the headlights illuminating the empty asphalt ahead. Both he and Kelly sat in stunned silence, staring out the window at the paddock. The gully was perhaps 100 yards away from the edge of the road, down a slight embankment, and hovering just a few feet above the long, damp grass at the bottom of the gully was the object. Now that it was so close, Kelly could see that the orange glow was coming from a ring of massive, brilliant lights, situated around the belly of a truly enormous circular craft. The craft itself was dark, completely solid, and staggering in its proportions. Kelly later estimated that it was easily 150 feet in diameter, large enough to cover half a football field. It was hovering silently, absolutely motionless, in the blackness of the valley. The light pouring from the bottom of the craft was so intense, so overwhelmingly bright, that it illuminated the entire paddock. Kelly could see every blade of grass, every detail of the wooden fence posts, all bathed in a harsh, unearthly, pulsating amber glow. It was so bright that it completely overpowered the darkness, turning the night into an eerie, terrifying midday. Kelly was paralyzed. She could not speak, she could not move, she could barely breathe. She felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of insignificance in the face of this massive, impossible structure. But layered underneath the terror was a strange, almost hypnotic fascination. She simply could not look away. Andrew, however, reacted completely differently. He stared at the craft for only a few seconds before his practical, protective instincts completely overrode his curiosity. "I don't like this," Andrew said, his voice tight with tension. "I don't like this at all. We are getting out of here right now." He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, the tires spinning momentarily on the damp asphalt before catching, and they sped away from the hovering craft, continuing down the winding road. Kelly twisted in her seat, pressing her face against the rear window, watching the massive, glowing shape fade into the distance behind them as the road curved and the trees blocked her view. For the next mile or so, the silence in the car was deafening. Neither Kelly nor Andrew spoke. They were both desperately trying to process what they had just witnessed, trying to find a rational, logical explanation for a 150-foot hovering disc in the middle of a dark Australian valley. But there was no logical explanation, and they both knew it. "Did you see the size of that thing?" Kelly finally whispered, her voice trembling, breaking the heavy silence. Andrew kept his eyes rigidly fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I saw it, Kel," he said sharply. "I saw it. But we're just going to keep driving. We're going home. Just don't look back." Kelly nodded slowly, turning her attention to the dark road ahead. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The adrenaline was still pumping violently through her veins, but a wave of profound relief began to wash over her. They had driven away. They had escaped, whatever that terrifying thing was. They were safe in their car, the kids were still fast asleep in the back, and in another 20 minutes, they would be home, safe and sound in their beds, locking the doors against the darkness outside. But that feeling of relief would prove to be tragically short-lived. About 5 minutes later, they rounded another sharp, blind curve on the Belgrave-Hallam Road. As the headlights swept across the new stretch of asphalt, the comforting darkness of the night was suddenly, violently shattered. The intense, blinding, pulsating amber-orange light was back. But this time, it wasn't hovering in a distant gully, and it wasn't flying high up in the sky. This time, the massive, unimaginable craft was hovering directly over the road, dead ahead of them. The sheer scale of the object was horrifying. It spanned the entire width of the road and stretched far out over the dense trees on either side. It was so low that Kelly felt as if the bottom of the craft was going to scrape against the roof of their car. The light pouring from it was indescribable. It was not just bright, it was a physical force. It flooded the interior of their car, washing out the glow of the dashboard and casting deep, sharp, terrifying shadows across Andrew's face. The light was so harsh, so penetrating, that Kelly instinctively threw her arms up over her face to protect her eyes, feeling a sudden, intense heat radiating through the windshield. Andrew slammed on the brakes as hard as he could. The tires screamed against the cold pavement, the car violently fishtailing before finally skidding to a halt directly underneath the edge of the massive, hovering structure. The moment the car stopped, something completely inexplicable happened. The engine, which had been humming steadily just seconds before, instantly died. It didn't sputter, it didn't cough, it just stopped dead, as if the power had been instantly drained from the battery. The headlights snapped off, the radio went silent. The heater fans ceased spinning. They were plunged into absolute silence, surrounded only by the blinding, unearthly orange glow. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Kelly. She turned her head frantically, checking on her children in the back seat. Miraculously, despite the violent stop and the blinding light, all three children were still completely unconscious, slumped over in their seats, deeply asleep. Kelly turned back to Andrew. He was sitting completely frozen, staring up through the windshield at the massive, dark underbelly of the craft. His face, illuminated by the orange light, was an absolute mask of terror. "Andrew," Kelly whispered, her voice choking in her throat. "What do we do? Andrew, start the car. Start the car." Andrew reached for the ignition key, his hand shaking violently. He twisted it, but nothing happened. Not a click, not a spark. The car was completely, utterly dead. Suddenly, the suffocating silence of the night was broken by a sound that would haunt Kelly Cahill for the rest of her life. It was a low, powerful, vibrating hum. It wasn't the mechanical sound of an engine or the roar of a jet turbine. It felt more like a physical vibration, a deep, resonant frequency that Kelly could feel vibrating in her bones, rattling her teeth, and making the metal frame of the car tremble. And then, without warning, the intense orange light suddenly snapped off. It was replaced instantly by absolute pitch black darkness. It took a few agonizing seconds for Kelly's eyes to adjust to the sudden lack of light. As her vision slowly returned, she looked out the windshield into the dark night. The massive craft was no longer directly above them. It had moved, silently and instantaneously, and was now resting on the ground in a large, flat clearing just off the right side of the road, perhaps 100 feet away. But the craft was no longer the most terrifying thing in the clearing. Standing in a semicircle beneath the dark, looming shape of the object were figures. Kelly stared, her breath catching in her throat, her mind violently rejecting what her eyes were clearly showing her. There were perhaps half a dozen of them. They were incredibly tall, towering well over 7 feet in height. But they were not human. They possessed a humanoid shape. They had arms, legs, a torso, and a head, but they were completely devoid of any defining features. They looked like silhouettes cut out of the blackest, most absolute darkness imaginable. They were darker than the night surrounding them, a dense, void-like blackness that seemed to absorb any faint ambient light in the clearing. They had no clothing, no discernible skin texture, no hair, but they had eyes. Set into the featureless, dark expanse of their faces were large, bulbous, glowing red eyes. The eyes did not reflect light. They emitted a dull, hateful, burning crimson glow, like the embers of a dying fire. Kelly sat completely paralyzed in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at these towering dark entities. She felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard that she thought it might shatter. And then, Kelly felt something else. It was not a physical sensation, but a profound, overwhelming psychic pressure pressing down on her mind. As she looked at those glowing red eyes, she suddenly felt an intense wave of absolute, pure, concentrated evil wash over her. It was a feeling of profound malice, a sense of deep, ancient hatred directed entirely at her. She felt, with absolute certainty, that these beings were not just observing them, they were a predatory threat, and they intended to do them unimaginable harm. "Andrew," Kelly gasped, tearing her eyes away from the figures and looking at her husband. Andrew was sitting perfectly still, staring blankly ahead. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but his knuckles were no longer white. His grip was relaxed. His face was completely devoid of emotion, his eyes glazed and unblinking. "Andrew!" Kelly screamed, reaching over and shaking his arm violently. "Andrew, wake up! Look at them! We have to go!" But Andrew did not react. He simply sat there, staring straight ahead, completely unresponsive, as if he had been hypnotized or his mind had been simply switched off. Kelly realized with a surge of utter despair that she was entirely on her own. She turned her attention back to the clearing. The tall, dark figures had not moved. They were simply standing there, staring at the car with those glowing red eyes. Then, a sudden, powerful, overriding thought pierced through the chaos in Kelly's mind. It was not a logical thought, but a primal, desperate instinct. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to get out of the car. She felt that if she stayed trapped inside this metal box, she would die, her husband would die, and her sleeping children would be taken. She had to do something. She had to confront them. Before she could even fully process what she was doing, Kelly's hand was on the door handle. She pulled it, shoved the heavy car door open, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The moment her boots hit the cold, damp asphalt, the silence of the night rushed in around her. She could smell the sharp scent of the eucalyptus trees mixed with a strange, unnatural odor, something that smelled like burnt ozone and metallic sulfur. Kelly slammed the car door shut behind her, the sound echoing loudly like a gunshot in the silent valley. She took a few tentative steps away from the car, moving toward the edge of the road, her eyes locked onto the towering black silhouettes standing in the clearing. The fear was absolute, rendering her legs weak and heavy, but the bizarre compulsion pushed her forward. She stopped at the edge of the asphalt, standing near the rough gravel shoulder, facing the clearing. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Kelly simply stood there, a small, fragile human woman, staring down half a dozen towering, unearthly entities beneath a massive, silent craft. Then, the figures began to move. They did not walk. They did not take steps. They seemed to glide across the damp grass, closing the distance between the craft and the road with terrifying, effortless speed. As they drew closer, Kelly could see that their movements were fluid, almost liquid, yet impossibly fast. The feeling of overwhelming, pure evil intensified, pressing against her mind until it felt like a physical weight crushing her skull. The glowing red eyes locked onto her, burning with that hateful crimson light. Kelly opened her mouth to scream, to shout at them, to demand that they leave her family alone. But before a single sound could escape her throat, the lead figure, now only a few dozen yards away, raised a long, dark, featureless arm and pointed it directly at her. Instantly, Kelly felt a force slam into her. It was not a physical blow. It was not a blast of wind or a shockwave. It was an invisible, devastating force that struck her squarely in the chest and simultaneously inside her mind. She felt a sharp, agonizing pain explode behind her eyes, followed immediately by the sensation of being violently thrown backward. The world around her, the dark trees, the hovering craft, the red-eyed entities, dissolved into a blinding flash of white light. And then Kelly Cahill fell into absolute, bottomless nothingness. When Kelly opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the smell of the car heater. She blinked, her vision slowly coming into focus. She was sitting in the passenger seat of their car. She was slumped awkwardly against the door, her neck aching from being bent at an uncomfortable angle. The engine was running. The low, familiar hum filled the cabin. The headlights were on, cutting through the darkness, illuminating the asphalt ahead. Kelly sat up slowly, feeling a wave of intense nausea and profound disorientation wash over her. Her head was pounding with a vicious, throbbing migraine, and her mouth tasted powerfully of metallic copper and old blood. Though she wasn't bleeding, every muscle in her body ached, feeling heavy and profoundly exhausted, as if she had just run a marathon. She looked over at Andrew. He was sitting in the driver's seat, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, driving the car. His face was pale, his jaw set in a tight, rigid line. "Andrew?" Kelly whispered, her voice raspy and weak. Andrew flinched slightly at the sound of her voice, but he did not take his eyes off the road. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice monotone, devoid of his usual warmth. I feel sick," Kelly murmured, rubbing her temples. She turned her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck, and looked into the back seat. The 3 children were still there, still completely unconscious, sleeping soundly in the exact same positions as before. Kelly turned back to the windshield, staring at the winding road. Her mind was a chaotic, fragmented mess. She remembered the massive craft hovering over the road. She remembered the engine dying. She remembered the blinding orange light, the terrifying dark figures with red eyes in the clearing, getting out of the car, and the invisible force slamming into her. But how was she back in the car? How was the engine running? Why were they driving? "Andrew," Kelly said, her voice trembling as the panic began to return. "What happened? The craft, those things in the field. How did we get away?" Andrew finally glanced over at her, his expression tight, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken dread. "I don't know, Kel," he said quietly. "I honestly don't know. The car just died. And then it started again, and we drove away. That's it. That's all I know." Kelly frowned, the throbbing pain in her head worsening. Something was incredibly wrong. The sequence of events in her mind was shattered, disjointed. She looked down at the dashboard. The digital clock glowing in the center console caught her eye. She stared at the bright green numbers, her mind struggling to process the information. When they had pulled away from their friend's house, Kelly remembered looking at the clock. It had been just after midnight. The drive to the spot on the Belgrave-Hallam Road where they had encountered the craft should have taken no more than 20, perhaps 25 minutes. But the green numbers on the dashboard clock now read 1:45 a.m. Kelly felt a cold chill radiate through her entire body, sinking deep into her bones. She stared at the clock, then at the dark road, then back to the clock. An hour and a half had passed. They had lost an hour and a half of time, unaccounted for, gone into the void. "Andrew," Kelly whispered, her fingers shaking as she pointed at the dashboard. "Look at the time. Look at the clock." Andrew glanced down. He saw the numbers. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he said absolutely nothing. He simply pressed his foot a little harder on the accelerator, desperate to get his family home, desperate to put distance between them and whatever had happened in the dark valleys of the Dandenongs. The rest of the drive was completed in suffocating, terrified silence. When they finally arrived at their house, they quickly and quietly carried their still sleeping children inside and put them to bed. Neither Kelly nor Andrew wanted to discuss what had happened. The fear was too raw, the confusion too absolute. They just wanted the safety of their own bed, hoping that when the sun rose, the nightmare would fade, and they could convince themselves that it had all been some bizarre shared hallucination brought on by fatigue. But the nightmare did not end with the sunrise. In fact, the true horror of their encounter was only just beginning to manifest. When Kelly woke up the next morning, the blinding migraine was still pounding against the inside of her skull. The metallic taste in her mouth was stronger, making her feel violently nauseous. Her entire body ached with a deep, profound lethargy, making it incredibly difficult to even climb out of bed. She stumbled into the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. As she stood before the mirror, taking off her nightgown to prepare for a shower, she froze. She stared at her reflection, her breath catching in her throat. a fresh wave of terror washing over her. Located just below her navel, clearly visible on her pale skin, was a distinct, raised, angrily red mark. It was not a rash or a bruise. It was a perfectly formed, geometric triangle. The sides of the triangle were sharp and precise, as if the shape had been burned or branded into her flesh. Kelly touched the mark with trembling fingers. It was incredibly tender, radiating a dull, pulsating heat. Over the next few days, Kelly's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The intense lethargy made it impossible for her to complete simple household chores. The migraines were agonizing, often accompanied by severe bouts of vomiting and dizziness. She felt as though her body had been subjected to massive trauma, or perhaps exposed to a high dose of dangerous radiation. Andrew, too, was suffering, though he tried to hide it. He was plagued by terrible, disjointed nightmares that woke him up screaming in the middle of the night, covered in cold sweat. He became withdrawn, irritable, and jumpy, constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows. Kelly eventually went to a doctor to have the triangular mark examined and to seek relief from her physical symptoms. The doctor was baffled. He took blood tests, examined the burn, and ran a battery of exams. But he could find no conventional medical explanation for her extreme fatigue, the metallic taste, or the perfectly geometric burn mark on her stomach. He prescribed painkillers for the migraines and advised her to rest, suggesting she might be suffering from a severe viral infection or an acute stress reaction. But Kelly knew it was not a virus. She knew it was not stress. She knew with terrifying certainty that it was connected to the lost hour and a half on the dark road, the massive hovering craft, and the tall, dark figures with the red eyes. Desperate for answers and unable to cope with the lingering terror on her own, Kelly realized she needed help from someone who understood these phenomena. After conducting some quiet, frantic research, she discovered a reputable, scientifically minded organization in Australia dedicated to investigating unexplained aerial phenomena. In September of 1993, Kelly gathered her courage and contacted a man named John Oshettle. John Oshettle was a seasoned, highly respected investigator with a group called Phenomena Research Australia, or PRA. He was not a conspiracy theorist or a sensationalist. He approached cases with a strict, rigorous forensic methodology, demanding hard evidence and physical proof. When Kelly told him her incredible story over the phone, detailing the massive craft, the entity encounter, the missing time, and the physical marks on her body, John was naturally skeptical. He had heard hundreds of wild stories, and most of them fell apart under basic scrutiny. However, the sheer terror in Kelly's voice, her reluctance to speak publicly, and the specific details she provided compelled him to take the case. John Oshettle agreed to meet with Kelly and Andrew, and he immediately launched a comprehensive investigation into the incident. His first step was to take Kelly back to the exact location on the Belgrave-Hallam Road where the encounter had occurred. It was a difficult, deeply traumatic experience for Kelly to return to that dark curve, even in the safety of daylight. But she managed to point out the exact clearing where the craft had landed and the entities had stood. John Oshettle and his team from PRA descended on the site with an array of scientific equipment. They cordoned off the area and began taking extensive soil samples, measuring the grass and sweeping the clearing with highly sensitive magnetometers. What they found in the dirt of that quiet, empty paddock was absolutely astonishing. And it completely shifted the investigation from a terrifying psychological event into a hard physical reality. In the exact center of the clearing where Kelly claimed the massive craft had rested, the investigators found a large, perfectly circular impression pressed deep into the soil, as if something incredibly heavy had sat there. The grass within this circular impression was noticeably different from the surrounding vegetation. It was stunted, brittle, and appeared to be scorched or chemically burned at the roots, despite there being no evidence of a conventional fire. But the most compelling evidence came from the soil analysis. The dirt taken directly from the circular impression contained bizarre, highly localized magnetic anomalies. The magnetic field within the circle was significantly distorted compared to the soil just a few feet away. Furthermore, Chemical analysis of the soil revealed elevated, unusual traces of specific elements, including traces of sulfur and a distinct lack of natural microorganisms, as if the soil had been briefly subjected to intense, sterilizing radiation or extreme microwave heat. John Auchettle was stunned. The physical evidence on the ground perfectly corroborated Kelly's story of a massive, incredibly powerful craft landing in that exact spot. He interviewed Kelly and Andrew separately, over and over again, using careful interrogation techniques designed to trip up liars or people suffering from hallucinations. Their stories remained perfectly consistent, matching down to the smallest detail. But the most shocking, paradigm-shifting revelation of the entire investigation was yet to come. It was a development so profound that it elevated the Kelly Cahill incident from a terrifying personal encounter into one of the most credible, ironclad UFO cases in history. In March of 1994, several months after Kelly had first contacted investigators, the story of a strange encounter in the Dandenongs began to circulate very quietly in local community circles. Kelly had not gone to the press, but rumors of the PRA investigation had leaked. Through these quiet channels, a woman contacted John Auchettle with a story that made the seasoned investigator's jaw drop. The woman's name was Jane. On the night of August 8th, 1993, extending into the early hours of August 9th, 1993, Jane had been driving down the exact same stretch of the Belgrave-Hallam Road. She was not alone in her car. She was driving with her husband, Bill, and her close friend, Glenda. Jane, Bill, and Glenda did not know Kelly or Andrew Cahill. They had never met them, lived in a different town, ran in completely different social circles, and had absolutely no knowledge of Kelly's encounter. When John Auchettle interviewed Jane, Bill, and Glenda, they recounted a story that was a perfect, terrifying mirror of Kelly's nightmare. They described driving down the winding road just past midnight. They described seeing a massive, circular craft hovering in the sky, emitting a blinding, pulsating orange light. They described their car engine suddenly dying, the headlights shutting off, and the terrifying hum vibrating through the metal. And then they described the figures in the clearing. Separately, in isolated interviews, Jane, Bill, and Glenda all described seeing incredibly tall, featureless black silhouettes standing beneath the dark craft. And all three of them explicitly described the entities possessing glowing, burning red eyes. They too experienced the overwhelming sensation of pure, malevolent evil pressing down on their minds. They too felt the sudden flash of light, and they too experienced a massive block of missing time, arriving home over an hour and a half later than they should have, with absolutely no memory of how they got there. To ensure the integrity of the investigation, John Auchettle asked Kelly Cahill and independently asked Jane, Bill, and Glenda to draw sketches of the craft and the entities they had seen without allowing them to communicate or see each other's drawings. When John laid the sketches out on a table side by side, the results were chilling. The drawings, produced by people who had never met and had never spoken to one another, were virtually identical. The shape of the massive disc, the placement of the blinding lights, the towering, dark stature of the entities, and the specific, terrifying detail of the glowing red eyes were all consistent across every single drawing. The presence of an independent, entirely separate car full of witnesses, completely corroborating the most bizarre and horrifying details of Kelly's account, provided an absolute, undeniable layer of credibility to the event. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that what happened on that dark road in the Dandenong Ranges was not a hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare, or an elaborate hoax. It was a real, physical event, witnessed simultaneously by two separate groups of people. To this day, the Kelly Cahill encounter remains an open, deeply unsettling mystery. John Auchettle and the investigators at PRA compiled a massive dossier on the case, documenting the soil anomalies, the medical records of the physical marks, and the identical testimonies of the independent witnesses. But they could never provide a definitive answer as to what exactly happened during that missing hour and a half. Under the guidance of investigators, Kelly attempted to undergo regressive hypnosis to unlock the memories of the missing time, but the process was agonizingly difficult. Under hypnosis, Kelly recalled flashes of being taken inside the dark craft, lying on a cold table and being surrounded by the tall, red-eyed entities as they conducted terrifying, incomprehensible procedures on her body, which explained the triangular burn mark on her stomach and her subsequent illness. However, the memories were so deeply traumatic and the fear so overwhelming that the hypnosis sessions often had to be aborted for her own psychological safety. Kelly Cahill eventually wrote a book detailing her experiences, not for fame or fortune, but out of a desperate desire to process the trauma and find others who might have experienced the same horrific event. She has remained steadfast in her account for decades, never altering her story, despite facing immense skepticism and ridicule from the public. The massive, silent craft with the blinding orange lights has never been officially identified by the Australian government or military. The towering, dark entities with the glowing red eyes remain a complete enigma. What we are left with is a truly terrifying reality. On a quiet, cold night in 1993, two separate cars full of ordinary people drove down a winding Australian road and intersected with something ancient, powerful, and entirely unknown. They were stopped, they were paralyzed, and they were taken. It serves as a deeply unsettling reminder that the vast, empty darkness of the world is not always as empty as we hope it is. When we drive down those dark, isolated roads, trusting in the thin metal frame of our cars to protect us from the wilderness outside, we must accept the terrifying possibility that sometimes the things waiting in the dark are far worse than anything we could ever imagine. And if they decide to step out of the shadows and block the road ahead, there is absolutely nothing we can do but wait, in blinding light and paralyzing terror, for them to decide our fate. What do you think really happened out there in the Dandenong Ranges in the early hours of August 9th, 1993? Were these two separate vehicles intercepted by something completely unearthly, or is there another explanation hiding in the shadows? Let me know your theories in the comments down below. If this case sent a chill down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss our next journey into the unknown. The world is full of dark roads and unexplained phenomena, and I know some of you have had your own brushes with the bizarre. If you have any stories, creepy encounters, or terrifying sightings of your own, I want to hear them. Send your accounts to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your experience might just be featured in an upcoming episode. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Thank you for riding into the dark with me tonight. Until next time, stay safe out there.